Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Klint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today I'm joined by Andrea Osborne, a seasoned HR leader with over 20 years of experience in M&A, talent strategy, and leadership development. She's worked with major organizations like IBM and Genesys, leading global HR due diligence, deal negotiations, and executive retention strategies. In this episode, we're diving into a critical M&A topic, how to identify and support top teams and critical talent during a deal. Andrea will talk us through the importance of crafting a talent strategy from the very start of a deal at the term sheet stage, assessing key leaders during due diligence and integration planning, retention strategies that go beyond cash and equity. Let's get started. Andrea, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Klint.
Well, I was really thrilled when you reached out and we said, let's have a conversation about talent. It's such a critical part of M&A and such a key part of the value that we're paying for when we buy another firm.
Yeah, absolutely. And more today compared to acquisitions of sometimes in the past, the people are really the key to grabbing value out of the transaction and really what you're acquiring at the end of the day.
Absolutely. So you've obviously worked extensively in HR leadership and M&A. What are some of the biggest people-related challenges that you've seen in deals?
I think it all starts with the top team, and it starts from day one. That leadership alignment between the team you're acquiring and your organization and the relationship, but also being on the same page around how the deal will evolve and what the acquiring company will do with the acquisition once it comes into play and into the organization is so key. Otherwise, expectations and speed and the real results that the acquisition can bring for the company just are that much slower and difficult to achieve.
Yeah, it's broken my heart a few times in my career when I've had folks walk into HR office hours and 2-3 months after a deal is closed, we're just doing a check-in and they're like, can you tell me what's going on because my boss doesn't know? And that can just be really rough. And you wonder why the business is feeling stalled.
Yeah. And the biggest thing too can be that top team is not communicating to their employees of what's going on. And you really have to have a solid communication strategy of what you want to say when and how quickly to the organization. And if you can't get that message out there, it'll be filled with the void of headhunters coming to target your talent or other acquired employees in the organization who may not have the type of experience, may not have had the type of experience that you want to build for this acquisition. So it becomes a snowball rolling downhill pretty quickly.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about talent strategy, and you mentioned that it should start early. So how can companies factor leadership and critical roles into the deal structure from the very start when you're working on that term sheet?
Yeah, absolutely. Because what happens in the term sheet, even those initial negotiations, is going to color what happens later and give you the tools that you need as an HR leader and working with the business to put the right retention strategies in place. I think it's super important. Some serial acquirers already have this mapped out, but if you're in the early stages or haven't become consistent, the HR leader has to be involved in those early term sheet negotiations. So is the retention budget part of deal value or is it in addition to? So how that's crafted in the term sheet becomes super important. I'm a big fan of it not being part of deal value because it gives you as the acquiring company a lot more levers later on. But there are reasons to do it as part of the deal structure. And it then influences how you'll implement and how you'll use it in many, many ways.
Yeah. So I've talked to quite a few HR leaders, Andrea, who aren't brought in at the term sheet stage. And it's obviously some experience that you have. You've been invited to the table at that point. What are some of the things that you've done in your career that help validate, yes, I belong here. I belong having these term sheet conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, build a really strong, close relationship with your CFO, who's usually got the close relationship with the corporate development team. If you don't have a corporate development team, it's going to be your CFO who's having those conversations, right? Someone needs to be in that piece, and your CEO can also help if needed. But it's really about being able to articulate the value of the talent and how you can negotiate the best possible alignment between those business leaders at the beginning. So think about things like what is the history with these top teams? I recommend doing research very early on who they are. And the internet and AI can give you lots of great information. Just be careful about what you put out in the public domain these days, right?
Right.
But know who you're dealing with. If they're serial acquirers or if they're serial entrepreneurs, they may or may not stick around longer and you might need a different strategy. You can also find lots of public information on them if that's the case, if they are kind of those serial entrepreneurs. If you're acquiring a larger company with a different organization, all of that history is super helpful for the negotiation. And you and your corporate development leader can tag team in what those things look like. In addition, if there's global components to it, every time you go from one jurisdiction to another, retention, cash, equity, all of those things have different components. And it's really important to then understand and think through what's going to be motivating those senior teams and what's going to be their driver for the next steps of the acquisition.
Now, fantastic advice. So you talked about looking at public information, and I consider that a really critical early diligence stage activity. What else do you do during diligence that can help you find red flags around talent risks? And what are some of the things that you found companies can do to proactively address those talent risks?
One of the things we implemented that I really, really think is important is everyone who's interacting with the target company and the senior leadership is a source of information. And you as HR are a key point of pulling that all together during the diligence process. What are the clues and hints you're getting about their motivations? I'm a big fan of in-person diligence, really bringing people together for 2 or 3 days. So you have lots of opportunities for informal interactions, coffee, running into people in the restroom. I mean, literally locking yourself in a hotel for a couple of days and going through those experiences, but then make sure you pull the leaders together to gather the information. What are you seeing and hearing? What are they really saying? It's good for the rest of due diligence, but it's super important around the culture, how the senior leaders are viewed, and you get to interact more specifically with all facets of the organization, not just what the CEO or the bankers or the senior team want you to be seeing. And that information is downright gold, especially as you're building your talent strategy through the acquisition. I have a deal once where we had that situation, but no one was talking. No one would say anything without the blessing of 1 or 2 people. And it tells you a lot about the culture and what it was going to take to integrate them into the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how folks can be on just, I don't want to say their best behavior, but a different kind of behavior during a 1 hour diligence call. And I think you're right. You see a different side of people when they're at dinner, when they're just in the office, when they're interacting with folks. I think that's really important. Unfortunately, that seems to be one of the things that's gone away with the pandemic. We don't necessarily need to spend time there.
Yeah. I mean, we used to structure a dinner in the evening to, relax at the end of the day. We were strategic about who sat next to whom, which conversations we wanted to have. We prepped before the dinner. It's useful from a diligence perspective and also to get to know the team, build trust, build relationships. But every interaction is diligence.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I may put that on a t-shirt. So, Andrea, many acquisitions are really talent acquisitions, but some key leaders may only be needed for a short time. How should companies plan ahead for that type of situation?
I think it comes in a couple of different pieces. Like one, hey, I'm HR. I realize if we're acquiring a company with HR, or if I'm getting acquired, they might not need HR for very long. So I have a transitional role to play during the acquisition. And I think it's important to be upfront with those types of folks in the transaction and build it in to the model. We used to use the term transition and say, hey, it's obvious. We're not going to lie to you. We'll try to find you another role within the organization, but this particular function will go away, and build it into their terms and conditions and what that looks like. It's also common sometimes, just like the example I was saying before, that senior leader that wouldn't let anyone talk or communicate might not be a long-term fit, and you might choose as part of your talent strategy to get rid of some of that senior team. It's important to be upfront about that. Like, we do not think you should be here longer than 2 or 3 months of transition after we go and position, because otherwise it's once you announce or once you close, it moves really fast. And you don't want something to derail unintentionally where you've planned on taking the integration.
I know one of the things that I've seen is that the nice soft landing can be really helpful for everybody else's morale, for those folks that are going to be transitioning. They see that you've taken care of their colleagues on their way out, and they feel, look, nobody loves it when that happens. I don't love it when I have to do it, but at least people feel like their colleagues are being treated with respect.
Exactly. And you brought up a really good point, which is everyone is watching. They'll all see. They all know.
So let's say we flip that scenario where we only needed a leader for 2 to 3 months. What happens when you need that leader for 2 to 3 years to really deliver value? How do you think about retention, and what are some of the strategies that you've seen be effective for keeping top talent engaged during and after a deal?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of it depends on what is the strategy. Back to what is the strategy for the acquisition? Are you fully integrating? Is it a bolt-on? What is the real business driver for how that's going to work? We've done a number of acquisitions in my history where we had to re-platform the technology, rewrite things so that it could integrate fully into ours. So we bolt it on for a little while and then integrate later. Okay. So I've kind of done soup to nuts in that. I'm a big fan of integrating early and quickly, but having those dynamics on the table so that you can have upfront conversations with it and have the leadership team help you align. And in that situation, it's super important that you have a plan for knowledge transfer. So cash and equity retention for long-term retention for 2 or 3 years, it's really important to back end load that with cash and things in the future, because there's no motivation. Yeah, go for it.
I'm sorry, Andrea, I didn't mean to cut you off. You used the term back end load, and I just would love to have you explain that to folks because I see a lot of folks in corp dev where I use that expression. They don't quite know what that means. So would you mind just talking a little bit about how you might structure a cash incentive?
Yeah, absolutely. I highly recommend not putting it in the term sheet of how you structure it. I recommend doing it in diligence so you can figure it out as you learn more about the organization, kind of going back to the front. But for example, having the highest percentage of the distribution of the retention at the end is back end loading it. So I've often done structures that were 10% at 6 months, 20% at a year, and 70% at 2 years. It keeps them, it's your insurance policy. It keeps them engaged for a longer period of time. And to truly do the knowledge transfer and encourage that, there's got to be some incentive at the end. And at the end of the day, I mean, some of these folks are getting life-changing money from the transaction, right? So the money, it doesn't have to be a massive amount. It just has to be enough to keep them invested and keep them invested in their team. And we tend to acquire companies where we have a large cultural alignment, a lot of buy-in from the senior leaders to stick around and really care about their people and their teams, and they want to make sure they're successful too. But that's back to where the alignment between the organizations comes in as well.
Wonderful. And I cut off your train of thought, so I apologize, but right before I so rudely interrupted you, I think you were getting ready to chat about some of those non-financial incentives like the alignment, but please can continue where you were headed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Where was I headed? Man. Okay, now we can cut that part out too.
It's all good.
Sorry, I am trying to think through where I was headed at that moment.
No, no worries, no
Yeah.
worries. So perhaps just chatting about some of the non-financial incentives that you've seen work.
Yeah. Okay. I think there's a piece around how founders in particular can become evangelists for the organization.
Mhm.
And so you've got to figure out what drives those organizations and those leaders for their own motivations. It's about them at the end of the day. And, what can they do with your customers? How can you give them broader visibility? Depending on the size of the organization that you're building, you have a small fish from a big pond becoming a smaller fish in a slightly larger pond. It
Right.
depends on what you're looking at, but really talk with that leader about that. The other thing I think that's super important is engaging coaches, external coaches for those leaders. You might have an internal coaching resource that's kind of separate from the business unit or team that you can use internally, but most often I find that someone who's experienced and understands what a founder or an incoming CEO is needing is a really valuable resource to help coach them through the transition, help them figure out what they want to do next and how they want to become a part of the new organization. It's invaluable. And if you've never used a coach yourself, I highly recommend trying it out. But having that outlet for them to get greater alignment with the organization or just deal with the changes and bounces that come with any acquisition is really important.
That is such a great recommendation. And I think coaches are an underutilized resource in our world, especially for executives working through hard transitions.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. I mean, there's going to be times when they disagree with where the company wants to go or what they thought they had said. My my favorite example, I guess I don't know, if favorite is the right word, but this comes back to my initial point around alignment. The business wanted to do one thing, XYZ. The incoming exec had already told his team before the acquisition was even closing
Yeah.
that we were going to get all this great investment. They built a hiring plan for doubling the size of their team, X, Y, and Z, and none of that was coming true. We were going to grow, but we were going to grow with our own teams. We were going to do things in different ways. There was a real lack of alignment on certain key components, and he had to walk that back, and it wasn't done in the necessarily the right way. And so it just comes down to, again, alignment and people
Right.
being on the same page as quickly as possible and being able to say no, or we don't have the answer to that yet when that alignment isn't quite there yet.
That's fantastic advice. So we've talked a little bit about aligning the leadership team on the mission, on the strategy. We've chatted a little bit about culture. So can you talk a bit more about the role of culture in talent retention and some of the key factors that'll influence whether leaders and teams will be able to successfully integrate into the new organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, culture is not about the parties or, those artifacts of an organization. It's more about how things get done every day. So you'll pick that up through the term sheet negotiation. You'll pick that up through due diligence, but you'll really learn it once you've acquired and closed and are really working with the teams day to day. I think it's super important to assess what elements of their culture you want to maintain or where you're going to have rubs. There's a number of assessment tools you can use for that type of thing. But also just talking with the team, being around. I think decision making and how decisions are made is super important. And that tends to be where I've seen big rubs in cultures and as those organizations come together, and you have to stay on top of it. So throughout the integration, right? So you're making sure everybody gets paid, you're making sure everything moves over from those fundamental basics, but how are they working? How are you bringing the managers in particular on board because they're your huge lever, right? There are not very many of them in an acquisition necessarily, depending on the size, but how do you bring those managers into the fold? How do you make sure they're communicating with their teams? And it's an ongoing drumbeat that you build with that acquisition. My favorite missteps that I've heard and seen is you're closing an acquisition and announcing one on, let's just say, February 2nd, and performance management for the following year starts March 1st.
Right.
I mean, they barely know how to find their email in the new company and everything else, carve the acquired managers out of your normal communications plans, build a special track for them, decide when you're integrating talent programs specifically so that key decisions around pay and performance and career development are managed very carefully from a people perspective. And those are all elements of their culture. And those are areas where you can see some of the biggest rub.
That's such great advice. The number of times I've run into situations where, say, the buyer does an annual performance review and promotion cycle, and it's very rigid, where a smaller firm might do it on what they consider to be a more merit-based basis. Hey, so-and-so is doing a great job. Let's promote them. Well, our standard is that it doesn't happen until the role changes, and your role hasn't changed, therefore no promotion. And that can
Or
be
your
really
anniversary.
demotivating. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and think about the number of times, Clint, when, an acquired company has had financial challenges. They've been paying people low. They have equity, right? That's supposed to balance things out, particularly in the tech space. At least the argument is they're paid low. But you're going to do that comp assessment. You're going to be looking at everything as you bring them in so that they're equitably paid with the current team, right? And
Right.
that things are navigated well with that. But those are the fundamentals. That's what they want to know. What am I going to get paid? How do you take some of those psychological safety pieces at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, make sure they're all taken care of, and then work on the other pieces as they come up.
Fantastic. So can you share an example of a deal where a strong talent strategy really made a difference? And maybe you've got one where it didn't go so well, and we can kind of look at the two.
I've got both for sure. I mean, listen, the world of acquisitions is hard. They don't always go the way you plan them to, but it's all about how you can recover and manage those missteps with a team. I think some of the hardest ones are carve outs, where you're not acquiring a whole company, but you're acquiring a piece of an organization from another organization, because the leaders, not all the leaders are coming, not all the organizational structure is coming. So you have to do it quick and fast and pull those pieces into place. So I'm thinking about one in particular, and I'll hide the name just to protect the innocent.
Right.
But it was a carve out from another major company, and very different cultures, very different structures. So coming from believe it or not, a highly structured organization into a much less structured organization. Hard to believe. And the level of alignment to the new culture in the team was surprising. They really wanted it. They really wanted a lot of freedom and a lot of ability to interact, but started kind of going rogue as well. It was like you let off the leash and all of a sudden. And so we really had to bring the executive team together to really reconnect. We hadn't done some of the work we really needed to do during diligence and around some of that because it was virtual and it was remote, and some of that stuff just wasn't there. And so you really didn't see it until the acquisition was closed and the team started to react. So again, comes back to the alignment, but with weekly conversations, with bringing the management team involved, the team then doubled in size and grew, and we replatformed, and the business, has really taken off and really captured the value that we finally wanted. It was just delayed a little bit. Yeah. And it's tough. It's rough for the teams and the people involved, but we were able still to do probably around 70% retention with that team. I'd have to go back and look, because at the core engineering level, that was really where the key of the information and knowledge around the platform was, and most of the senior leadership as well.
Oh. Look, that's fantastic. Anytime you've got a hiccup with a deal, to keep 70% is pretty good, especially in the tech space.
Yeah. And I mean, I often look at retention as far as those numbers in timeframes. So I'm going for almost 100% retention around 6 months. I mean, that's the goal. You're going to lose a few people in here, but you want to keep those headhunters out the door.
Right.
If you can be at around 80% or 80 to 90% after a year, I think you're kicking and doing it good. Yeah. But after about 2 years, I'm thinking you're usually hovering around 50. People have gotten their value. They've decided whether the new culture is right for them. And, depends on where those people sit in an organization, right? You don't want to lose all your customer success team. You don't want to lose all your sellers, but it depends on what function they're playing in the organization.
Right. Well, there'll also be some very natural job market attrition that'll happen over 3 years. There's a really interesting article by MIT Sloan School of Business. I think it was just before the pandemic, 2018, 2019, where they talk about the differences in retention from acquisitions, versus folks that are hired through more traditional channels. And the numbers you're talking about roughly track. So it's a really interesting piece of research for anybody who's trying to figure out, hey, what should this look like? And so I can link to that in the show notes for people who
No,
want to
I
see.
think that's great. I'm glad to see they did that. I mean, we did our own internal research, and it's a lot of work to make sure you can track that and pay attention to it. And you do want to report that out to your executive committee or your board on a regular basis if you aren't already looking at that. These populations need to be tracked, so your HRIS systems need to be able to identify them.
Right.
It's something we had to implement at Genesys is they weren't all trackable, so we had to fix that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, really seeing how those people have grown. And I do recommend too, if you already have people in your organization that were acquired, that have stayed and progressed to senior positions, and you have stories that you can craft and tell as part of your integration plan, and also bring those people into the helpful team of acquiring the new organization, being buddies for those people, particularly senior leaders, pairing them up, leverage the team you have. If you've done this before, that are, some of your shining stars, it's great development for them and really helpful to improve the retention and the acquisition.
Such fantastic advice. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for being so willing to share. Lots of gold, lots of tips there that folks can follow if they want to work on their retention during deals. If listeners want to connect with you or learn more, what's the best way for them to reach out?
Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Andrea Osborne in Colorado. There are a couple other of them out there, but I think you have my LinkedIn in the show notes potentially too. But feel free to pop a note with your invitation or connect. Just don't do it blindly. It's just a good LinkedIn habit anyway, but I'd be happy to chat.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Andrea, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate that. And best of luck in your new role.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Klint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.